He says, if instead you might find yourself in the position of being temporarily indulged by the record company, only to have them yank the chain at some point, hassling you to rework songs, sequences production, calling in hired guns to sweeten your record, turning the whole thing over to some remix jockey, whatever, then you're in for a bummer and I want no part of it. And he goes on to outline his exact methodology, which is kind of everything we're talking about. I'm going to make a record that sounds like.
You are listening to Tape Spaghetti, a podcast about the twisted and tangled innards of the music industry. Some of this content may not be for all listeners or viewers, so if it's not for you, no harm, no foul. We'll just catch you on the next one. All right, without further ado, let's get into it. Here we go.
Hello and welcome to Tape Spaghetti. I am Scott Marquardt, and I am joined, as always, by my lovely co-host, the elusive, the illuminating Blake Daniel Weiland. Blake, how you doing today?
I don't think I'm that elusive. I'm pretty easy to find, actually.
Yeah, I was just trying to find alliterative terms.
We're here. We're here in what I have now discovered to be one of my favorite parts of the week. Monday's not so bad. Monday's not so bad anymore. Now that I get to do this,
I like this too. It really has brightened up my Monday.
Mm-hmm.
It's nice to not think about work and just think about music, which I guess I work in music, but as always, it's a little bit less music-y on the inside than it might seem from the outside.
Yeah, there's a lot of hey, where's that package? Ship that. Where's the tracking number? There's a lot of that, which isn't very musical.
No, not tremendously.
Yeah, I'm with you, buddy.
Did you get out to anything fun this weekend?
Yeah, we had a good time. It was both my wife's birthday and Mother's Day, not the same day, though it will be next year. So we
did a 2-for-1.
Yeah, she doesn't like it, but
no, I wouldn't either.
But it for me, it's rather neutral. It's a good time. We had a nice weekend. We just it was mostly pretty relaxed. We went to a nice brunch. Went and did some mini golf, and then I went to a place called Rawest, which I must take you to next time you're in Portland, because it's an institution, and it's
what's a roke?
Rawest is a hot dog and burger stand, and it produces the greasiest fries you've ever had in your entire life, and somehow they're still delicious.
Oh, I can get down with some greasy fries, man.
I've never experienced French fries like this anywhere else.
The best fries are brined. I've learned that fries that are pre-brined for a period of a day or whatever before
in what
fried brine, salt water, I assume.
I don't know how that would work, but I'm not a fry cook, so
it works, trust me.
All right,
there's a place you can see from my porch called Riverside Grill Shack in Nashville that they have they're almost steak fries in terms of thickness, which I should hate. I'm not a steak fry man. They're
me either. Yeah,
the thinner the fry, the better. But these are delicious because they're amply brined.
Well, now we both have places to take each other to when we are in the respective each person's cities.
Yeah, you got to get out here.
Mm-hmm.
I didn't have too much going on this weekend myself, man. I also went to lunch. Mother's Day is brunch. Mother's Day is the Super Bowl for brunch chefs.
Oh yeah, yep.
It's got to be intense. And I'm excited, not related to that, but here midweek, I am going out to Salt Lake City to the Kilby Block Party Music Festival, which I go to. This is my 3rd year running going to this music festival.
I've never been to Salt Lake City.
Yeah, I mean, and you're pretty close to it.
Mm-hmm.
It's a lot further from me. Salt Lake City's all right, there's some cool stuff. There's not it's not New York or LA or anything. But this is just one of the best run music festivals I go to. It's got an amazing lineup. Every year I get to see New Order on my birthday, which is gonna be fun.
Oh, cool. Yeah.
Yeah. And Devo opens for New Order on that set.
All right.
And then there's 3 more days of great stuff. I get to see TV on the radio and just a lot of bands I love, a lot of new bands I'm pretty into. So I'm stoked about that. I find that getting older makes music festivals a little bit weirder.
Yes.
Because you're I'm going to be tired. It's a long day to be standing outside.
I never thought I would get to this point, but our mutual friend, Ryan Ratajski from Fuzzrocious Pedals, he told me this a long time ago. He's not that much older than us, but he's been in this longer than we have been. I remember he was like, oh man, got to go to this show. And oh man, I got to go say hi to people at this show. And he's like, I really like to go to shows, but man, I'm getting a little bit burned out. I was like, how do you get burned out on going to shows? It's my favorite thing. And now I find myself, this sounds like the dumbest complaint of all time to anybody listening. I find myself in a very similar situation where I'm like, but I am still a father and I can't be gone every night of the week. That's not going to work. So, I understand what you meant all those years ago, Ryan. It does get to be tiresome, but every time I do go, I'm always happy that I did.
Oh yeah, it ebbs and flows. Like last week, I did Metallica twice just for fun, and then I saw Gang of Four on Monday, which I was watching. Gang of Four. Yeah. I was watching Gang of Four this whole time, and I hadn't really like registered it. I'm like a fan, but not like as into them as some people. And so I noticed like, oh, the guitarist looks younger than the other guy, but I didn't think too much of it. And then at the end, he was like, and thank you very much to Ted Leo for playing guitar with us.
Oh,
like, what? That was Ted Leo.
Wow. Okay.
Holy cow.
Yeah.
And the bassist was one of the women from L7. That was playing, and it was the original vocalist and drummer. So that was cool. I got to see Bad Bad Not Good on Wednesday. That was fun. So I do run that gauntlet a little bit in Nashville, but I like it.
Yeah. No, I do. I like it too. I hope that didn't sound like a pure complaint. It was just more of a logistic reality. It's like, how do I pull all this off? This is a little bit challenging, but good problem to have.
Oh, 100%. And burnout's maybe a good segue into our particular topic today.
I'm excited to get into this topic. I've not been doing a ton of homework, but I've been doing a bunch of listening homework because
heck yeah,
what we're getting into is very near and dear to my heart. So I'll let you dive into it.
Well, feel free to interject at any time because you might know more than I do about some of this stuff.
It's possible. I've forgotten a lot about it. So there's a lot of that too.
Well,
here we go.
To remove the cloak of mystery for you, dear listener, today, well, I guess you have a title, so you already know what you're getting into. But the mystery that's been pervading up to this point in the podcast. Today, we are talking about Nirvana's album In Utero and the recording and making thereof. We are not talking about what happened kind of after that with Kurt Cobain's death. That is like a whole other episode.
That'll be like a whole month-long series. Yeah.
yeah. We a lot could be said about that whole thing. But for the most part, we're not going to touch that today.
Cool. There's a lot to unpack just with this, to be honest.
Yeah, there is a ton. So let's kind of dive into it. So before we get to In Utero, I have to set the stage a little bit. So Nevermind, the album, absolutely like top 100 albums all time. This comes out September 24th, 1991. They're on Geffen Records, so they've been signed up to like a major label. They're on a subsidiary called DGC Records, David Geffen Company, I believe it stands for. They make this record, and the record label is expecting it to sell okay. They're kind of expecting it to be kind of like Sonic Youth's Goo. So they're thinking maybe they might sell about 250,000 copies or so. Initially, they make up about 46,000 copies that ship to retail when this comes out. And as most people listening may know, this album sells a whole lot more than 46,000 copies.
Yes.
Smells Like Teen Spirit comes out on MTV. This is like an absolute, genre-defining, era-defining moment. The album reaches number 1 on the Billboard 200. It dethrones Michael Jackson's Dangerous, which is like wild. I mean, for a band that's like effectively like a small kind of punk band to suddenly be this big is crazy. They're selling 300,000 copies a week at the time. Goes to number 1 for like multiple weeks. By 1993, over 10 million copies of Nevermind have been sold, which is insane. It goes gold and goes platinum at like basically the same time. It's 5x platinum by 1996. Globally, there's over 30 million copies that have been sold. It recently reached 13 times platinum in December of 2024.
It's hard to process. This doesn't happen anymore.
No, Beyonce isn't even dreaming of selling, like 13 million or 30 million records.
No.
No one sells anything like that. They've invented like, album equivalent streams and things to try to be able to track what these things are, but this just doesn't happen.
Yeah.
It doesn't happen. Anyway, and as many of you know, it's not just like these album sales, but like this is a big cultural moment when Nevermind happens. This is kind of the alternative nation, quote unquote, explosion. Grunge becomes a mainstream thing. Hair metal, which had previously been like super dominant for, over a decade at this point, is effectively just like ended. You see all these like famous hair metal bands like getting a little bit more grungy. You see that with Van Halen. You kind of see it maybe with Guns N' Roses, though they were always like a little less hair metal-y than some hair metal.
I actually have a personal note on this that everybody can go check out. This is not a intentional plug, but it's directly tied to this. I recorded an episode with Tracy Guns of LA Guns and one of the founding members of Guns N' Roses. And
the Guns in Guns N' Roses.
Yep. Super great guy. Really like that guy a lot. He was talking about this as it was happening. And I, of course, had to dig in. I was like, when you heard this album, what were you guys thinking? And he's like, we were playing it at our sound checks just because it was so good and it was so heavy and so explosive. And every time there were people who hadn't heard it and they would come in. And I think he got an early copy, if I remember correctly. And people would just stop. Like the people working the venues would just stop and like, what is this? And he's like, I knew this is the next thing. Like, this is it. I'm paraphrasing a little bit, but he talked about it on my podcast. So of which I have too many, but if you want to go check it out, go check out Tracy Guns on the Tone Mob podcast. It's a good episode, but he talked about that specifically. And it was interesting to hear from somebody who was actually deep in it at the time.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, this single culturally is like a bomb going. I think more than almost anything else in music history, probably like Elvis and the Beatles like are kind of up there when that just explodes, but it doesn't happen all the time. I mean, there hasn't been something like that's happened, I think, since then.
I don't think so. And it's also kind of interesting to note that Elvis, the Beatles a little less so, but Elvis happened at a time when not everybody was listening to music, if that makes any sense. It wasn't like it's in every store you walk into, there's something playing. It was just, it's a little bit more of a build. It was probably one of the moments that made everybody start listening to music on a consistent basis. The Beatles kind of happened by that time, but like Nirvana, the music industry is very established at that point. Yeah. It's like things are the way they are and this is how it is. And they came in and just kicked everything over.
Yeah. And you're right. This had been going on for a little while, I think, but I think hair metal's like the sort of example of the label industry finding a thing that works and being able to really systematize it and formalize it and just churn out more bands that they can really reliably predict. Here's how that tour is going to go. Here's how the radio's going to go. It becomes a very profitable, very consistent thing of them. Maybe not carbon copying, but really following a specific formula. And so that's kind of the thing. You're right. When Nirvana comes out, what's obvious is that the formula has changed.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it kind of gets sold sometimes as though like Nirvana destroyed that formula, because in a lot of ways, like Nirvana came out feeling very fresh and very authentic and very like raw and rough around the edges. And it felt like that was kind of a real, drop kick to the record label industry, creating these very polished, like Winger and White Lion and all these like later hair metal bands. But in reality, the record label industry in no worlds is like toasted by this. In fact, they're just like, oh, this is the new formula.
Yep. Now we do this.
Mm-hmm. And they went hard into it.
Which we talked about. It was successful to a degree, but the carbon copies, quote unquote, that they were trying to make or trying to find weren't that. Nirvana was still very much a unique thing.
Yeah. I mean, I think in a lot of ways they don't know what it is just yet. As much as I just said, this is the next thing. There's not a million little tiny Nirvanas rolling around.
No.
You have like their big influences like the Melvins and the Pixies that exist, but in a lot of ways they're really going after basically every band in Seattle that they can. Yeah. Whether it's Alice in Chains or Soundgarden or any of those types of bands. Stone Temple Pilots. At the time, I think we don't probably appreciate the degree to which Stone Temple Pilots were derided by their peers as being a Pearl Jam copy.
No, because you and I, just due to our age, we heard all these bands in retrospect.
Yep.
So they were established acts by that time. I didn't even realize that people felt that way about STP until much later.
No, but I remember hearing they called them the Stone Gossard Pirates, which is kind of funny.
Okay, that's funny. I can't. Well, however you feel about it, that's funny.
So that, they're kind of the best example of what, at least at the time, was being painted as, oh, they're just carbon copying this thing that works and making another version of it.
Mm-hmm.
But, in any case, you get this huge generational sort of churn that occurs at this point. The thing has changed, and Nirvana's really kind of at the head of it. Like, they basically are being viewed as these generational spokespeople of the next generation, which is something that they're kind of not super comfortable with.
Right. Yeah, that's not, I mean, I think if you were to describe Kurt Cobain in one word, uncomfortable would be it.
Yeah, in a lot of ways. And I mean, so like this band, and we're not even to In Utero yet, but I'm trying to kind of paint the picture of where they're coming to when they go to make that album, because they went from, I mean, they'd been a band for a while and they've been touring, but they just exploded. Like, compared to what they were doing beforehand, it just was life-changing for them.
100%. And for a lot of their listenership and the bands around them as well. It was just such a big, it was kind of like a bomb going off, and there's all this fallout, though a lot of it's positive in this case, just all around the centerpiece that is Nirvana.
Yeah, and I think, like, it's one thing to think about, like, oh my gosh, your music's everywhere and is touching everybody, and that's like the most important thing about it. But from the perspective of the band, I think what would be crazy is realizing how much money is wrapped up in this thing now.
Oh, yeah.
Like, it's how many people are making their livelihoods on it, how big the team gets, how many people are out on the road with you. There's a lot of money centering around the band Nirvana.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
And in general, like, what's kind of interesting versus some of the other topics that we've talked about in this podcast is that there's a lot of TV interviews given at this time from different members of the bands. There's a lot of kind of weird snippets because, of course, everyone wanted to talk to them. They're super famous. And I watched a bunch of those. For whatever reason, all the ones I found online were always with like a French publication or like an Italian publication or something. So there's like subtitles underneath it. There was one where Kurt Cobain appears to be in like a rowboat in France talking. It was very odd. But, he's very disillusioned with the amount of mainstream attention. They very much they were this kind of anti-corporate band that, just like that, suddenly all of corporate music, its Eye of Sauron is trained completely on this sound in this band. So like they go from rejecting corporate rock to being corporate rock. Mm-hmm. They're the thing. They're the thing all the money's wrapped up in. So he's uncomfortable with that. He doesn't really seemingly like the mainstream attention. He once said he wishes he could be more like Pete Best, the original drummer for the Beatles. That's just not that remembered, which is ironic because, boy, is Kurt Cobain remembered.
Yes.
But Chris and Dave, the bassist and drummer for Nirvana, are basically equally as uncomfortable. Chris Novoselic around this time is saying that he senses the band's becoming tamer. Just kind of through all this, it felt like, the machinations of the music industry were kind of sanding off the rougher edges. And he was kind of already in one interview talking about how like it's not going to be that glossy when they make another record.
Mm-hmm.
And that's something that I think it really jumped out to me in doing research about this episode, is that in a lot of ways you listen to Nevermind, and especially if you know the hair metal and all that sort of stuff that came before it, it feels like this is a super raw, authentic, all those words I used earlier, sound. But the band, in interviews, the band does not feel that way. The band generally, and we'll probably talk about this on a future episode, but they felt like, the Butch Vig mixes and everything from Nevermind were super glossy. They talk about it like they made a Britney Spears record in all these interviews.
Yeah, well, I mean, probably because by comparison with their earlier stuff, that's what it felt like.
Yeah. To them, they're like, we're not here to make polished radio ready rock and roll. And I guess it kind of became that, even though I don't think it came right out of the gates as like, this is radio ready rock and roll.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think more than anything, what Butch did was he just caught the real them and just amplified it. I mean, it's not like there's a bunch of auto tune on Kurt's voice or anything like that. You know what I mean?
No, that's true. Yeah. But I think to them, and we'll touch on this as we get deeper into In Utero, but they kind of viewed the authentic sound of music as the sound of a band in the room, and things like overdubs and doubles and all of these sort of like thickening agents that you use in the studio, that to them just didn't sound, they wanted to sound like they sounded, playing in a brick walled club.
Yeah. Which makes sense
in a lot of ways.
I understand that.
So kind of jumping from there, I want to talk about like the things that they were kind of considering going in, because at this point I'm yada-yadaing over like tours and the massive fame from Nevermind, but they're very much kind of reeling from this thing, and the worst thing that I think has to happen when you're a band and you get that big is how do we follow it up? Right. Which is, I don't, with them, it's, we're just assuming a lot of things here. I get the vibe that what they wanted to do was like, hey, we've got more money than we'll ever need. We don't need to do anything. We can do whatever we want. And what I want to do is send a big middle finger to the record industry with this next record. That's the vibe I get. Yeah. Via the use of their money. Yeah, exactly. But yeah, I mean, that's it. So like, there's quotes from Kurt of this era where he says like, we wanted to capture the sound of us playing in a room, not a glossy pop record, kind of like we were just talking about. Novoselic was talking about Nevermind, as he called it, a bubblegum record. And wanted to get a bit more abrasive. Cobain was describing In Utero, this is a little bit after they recorded it before it came out, as uncompromisingly raw and abrasive. So you can see how they're kind of viewing it. They really felt that like studio polish and sheen was not what they wanted to replicate again. They wanted to do that sort of middle finger, so to speak, and really to kind of like connect with their underground roots. And it's something that I wanted to touch on here is that you get a sense even from Nevermind of like Nirvana, they don't necessarily worship their own fans. In a lot of ways, you get this sense that they kind of resent, not all, but some of the groups of people that became big fans of their band. The classic example is the lyrics from In Bloom, where it's, he's the one who likes all our pretty songs and he likes to sing along and he likes to shoot his gun, but he knows not what it means, right? Yeah, well, he's talked about it in interviews multiple times. From Kurt's telling of it, when he was growing up, these type of kind of macho gorilla dudes that would show up to their show were the ones that made his life extremely difficult growing up. Like, because he was a very sensitive, kind of poetic type of person. And, growing up during that time, those were the guys that got the wedgies, so to speak. And he's now seeing these same people, not the exact same people, but a version of them showing up to his shows and shoving other people like him around. And I feel like maybe he feels somewhat responsible for that pattern of behavior continuing to happen. Yeah. It's seeing the jocks all show out, the people that you were making music to kind of reject in some ways. I also think it's interesting, like this is kind of maybe some of the beginning of where this like grunge and post-grunge world kind of continued into like Woodstock 99. Where you do have a lot of this kind of aggro bro thing happening all around. And there's these mosh pits, but they become, kind of an icky thing for dudes to try to look real tough in a lot of ways. Which is not, what the bands are coming from. Yeah, and I have a couple friends that were at Woodstock 99, and the way they describe it is it's worse than even the documentary makes it look to be. Really? Which is pretty absurd, considering the documentary doesn't paint it in a very good light. No, it very much doesn't. And if you're listening to this and you haven't watched the documentary, it's real fun. Yeah, for something so horrible. The right word, but it's a good watch. It's interesting. That's the best word for it. It's you won't be bored at all. No, definitely not. So anyway, what we've kind of established up to this point, Nevermind's huge. Nirvana want to make something real. They want to get a little rougher. They want to get a little bit more aggressive. And the first kind of key to that lies in their choice of producer, which is the legendary Steve Albini.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
Now,
somebody I always wanted to get on the show, and I never did. So rest in peace. But
oh man. Yeah. I should just caveat right from the beginning. I'm a great admirer of a lot of Steve Albini's work. Post death, there was a lot of weird stuff that kind of came out about him that I've not researched deep enough to sort of pass judgment on. But there's maybe some sus stuff in his background, and I'm just gonna acknowledge that I don't know enough about it to rule on any of this sort of stuff.
Yeah, I also found that out about the same time, but I know as much about it as you do. So
yep.
Yep. I it definitely was like, oh, no,
yeah,
no. Hopefully that's not right.
Yes, I feel about the same way. And again, I haven't dug in. I started to dig into it a little bit when it came out, and I immediately wanted to stop reading it. So.
Yeah. So maybe that's just we're being a bit too sensitive, and we should learn a little bit more about our heroes in this case. But at this point, I'm not well versed enough to comment. But it doesn't.
That's how I feel.
It doesn't look good. Let's put it.
Doesn't look great. Yeah. But I'm gonna with that acknowledgement aside, I'm gonna skip over that to what I do know about with Mr. Albini. Which is the musical side. So Steve Albini is a legendary dude in his own right, both in his own bands and as a producer. With Big Black and Shellac and producing the Pixie Surfer Rosa and the Jesus Lizard and all sorts of stuff. He even worked with Robert Plant and Jimmy Page a little bit after he made In Utero, which I didn't quite realize.
Yeah, he's got quite the list of accolades under his belt, and his studio became pretty legendary. Not the one we're going to talk about today, but Electrical Audio. He was very much a person who always pushed for analog recording, which I always respect and think is very cool, and live in the room, kind of like what we're talking about here, just capturing bands in their truest, rawest form. He was a big fan of that.
Yep, 100%. And so Kurt Cobain's been familiar with him for a very long time. He worships the Pixies and Surfer Rosa as well as the Melvins. These are some of his most formative influences. So he had always kind of known about him in a lot of ways. And our sense is that that's a big reason why they kind of called on Steve was this work that he'd done on previous records. And of course, what we're talking about, he is a man that captures the sound of a band in a room. That is the Steve Albini thing, is leaving some mistakes in there, making it sound sort of quote unquote real, not being afraid of abrasive sounds or room sound and stuff like this. This is his calling card.
Yeah.
So interestingly, it was only a year or two or three ago that Nirvana published the letter that Steve Albini wrote to the band when they had engaged him, talking about working together. And
it was fascinating to read.
It's super, super cool. And I'm almost tempted to read the whole thing, but that would take a long time. So you should maybe check it out. If you Google Steve Albini letter to Nirvana, you will see it.
Yes.
But in essence, it's this super punk letter that he wrote to them. And Nirvana, at this time, is the biggest band in the world, basically. And they asked this guy to record him. And, he basically is hey, if you want to make a corporate record, you can make it with someone else.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. He's almost, the way he frames it, it's not quite this, but it is almost I don't want to work with you unless you follow these very specific parameters.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, 100%. I will read one little paragraph to this effect. He says, if instead you might find yourself in the position of being temporarily indulged by the record company, only to have them yank the chain at some point, hassling you to rework songs, sequences production, calling in hired guns to sweeten your record, turning the whole thing over to some remix jockey, whatever, then you're in for a bummer and I want no part of it. And he goes on to outline his exact methodology, which is kind of everything we're talking about of I'm going to make a record that sounds like you, and I'm not going to polish the crap out of it. I'm going to make it sound real good. I'm going to do my job. But I'm not going to make it sound like a band that you aren't.
Yep. Yeah. And he even goes as far as to outline, I was going to say how he wants paid, but rather how he doesn't want paid.
Yeah, that's a big thing. And it might come up again later, but we should cover it now. So in this letter, he talks about wanting to be paid like a plumber, basically. His view is that it's just completely unethical for producers, or he'd just call himself an engineer, most likely, to take points on the record. So to earn, a percentage of the money that's coming in from syncs and album purchases and, eventually streams and all this sort of stuff. This is very common in the music industry. A lot of producers get 3 points or whatever. It's always up for negotiation. He doesn't want any part of it. He wants to be paid for his time, and that's it.
Yeah. And I understand his point. And I think in some situations, he would be correct in this assumption, where it's like the producer didn't do a whole lot here. We've all heard stories like that. But I think in Steve's case and a lot of others' case, they kind of become an extra member of the band. And so I can understand, he thinks it's unethical, but I actually don't know if I fully agree with him on that. And this is weird for me to advocate for the music industry standard practice in some ways, because in a lot of ways I do disagree with them on lots of things. But here I'm like, well, I guess to me it depends. I mean, if he doesn't feel comfortable with it, then I think that is the correct course. But I would make an argument that there are many producers that fully deserve those couple points.
There super are. I mean, I think with this record and with a lot of the stuff he's done, I think that he can lean a little bit more towards like, hey, come in with the songs ready and like rehearsed and whatnot. And then like, I'm going to record what it sounds like. A little bit less so. And we'll get into this because this is very much what this album recording cycle was like. But, some bands, I remember hearing about Linkin Park when they would go, it was probably Rick Rubin. I feel like everyone recorded with Rick Rubin at the time. And they would take in 200 little fragments of songs into the studio. They'd spend 6 or 9 months or whatever living in the studio and just basically completely composing and writing the record all together. And for something like that, when the producer's around for that whole time, they're gonna be involved in that sort of stuff. I think it'd be difficult not to be involved in some creative decisions that border on like songwriting credit or, having some level of credit on the music that comes out. Whereas for a lot of Steve stuff, it's like, hey, come in, play your, I'll record you, and then we'll have a record.
Right.
I'm just setting up some mics. And I think it is interesting. In a lot of ways, like this has become, part of the legend of Steve Albini is like, I just want to get paid like a plumber for this album. He could have made all this money. And it's seen as this very modest thing. But his fee was $100,000.
It wasn't cheap. Yeah. It was
1993 money.
Yeah.
Which is a decent clip of money now. And I mean, it was kind of like a short recording session. So like, granted, he would have made, God knows how much money from taking points on the record. But it's sometimes I've heard this legend told, to imply that he just like was paid $20 an hour.
Right.
Which does not seem to really be the case.
Right. Yeah, he was compensated well for the work. And maybe that's his point. He's like, this is plenty. I don't need more than that.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, fair. I'm like, hey, no, the $500,000 you're going to pay me to record this episode, Blake, that's plenty. I don't need a piece of the ads you're going to sell on it or anything else. I'll just take my money.
Okay. Well, I forgot that wire transfer is going to be delayed. Slightly. Is that a problem? Oh, no. I think he just quit the podcast.
No, buddy, I'm here. I'm here.
Good.
I just want to be paid like a plumber.
A very expensive.
I would just like a union labor wage for the time that I spend on the podcast, and then I'm fine.
That actually would be pretty good. I don't know.
That would be better than we do right now.
Yeah, that'd be a good wage. I would accept that gladly. Actually, that'd be great.
Anyway, so, obviously Nirvana accepts Steve Albini's very specific terms for working with them, and they set out to make this record. In this letter, he proposes the studio that he wants to record it at, which we'll talk about. It's Pachyderm Recording Studio in Cannon Falls, Minnesota. When I was talking to you about this like last week, we're very familiar with Pachyderm. Have there been a bunch of other bands that have recorded there?
Yeah, I think there are replacements recorded there. And I can't remember. It's a pretty legendary studio. I mean, I'm sure that In Utero being recorded there is a part of what makes it that way. But it's popped up many times in my various musical researches, and I can't remember a lot about it except that it's where you go to go away, way out from anything. I think it was a big deal even to go into town to like get cigarettes and stuff. It was not a close by convenient location at all.
No, you're exactly right. So this is in a rural spot in Minnesota. There's a lot of woods, and it's supposed to be really beautiful, but they're actually recording in Utero in the winter. And it's like Minnesota winter. in a later interview, Dave Grohl was talking about, he's like, even walking from like my car into the studio was like potentially like a frostbite scenario because it was so cold. So in a lot of ways, like they're very much cooped up there. And they said there's a town that's like, it's like an antique store and maybe a general store. And like, that's it in the town. And they said they didn't remember ever going there. So the band basically just like, camps out at this spot way far away from anything else. There's on-site lodging, so they don't have to leave or anything. Like they're just living in here and recording. And I believe it was Steve Albini's idea, but they recorded and booked the time under the pseudonym the Simon Ritchie Bluegrass Ensemble.
I forgot about that. I did know that. That's pretty smart, actually. Because can you imagine? It just happens. I mean, it's happened with friends of ours even, but they get to a point where there's just, you get famous enough and there's just a certain percentage of the population that is a little crazy, and they're going to show up where you don't want them to, even if that's the middle of Minnesota. So
you don't want people like storming this small town to try to get a glimpse of Nirvana, which again, at the time is like the biggest and most famous band in the entire world.
Yes. But the point is, there are definitely people who would do that. So this was a good move.
Yeah. So, they're kind of holed up in this beautiful, if serene and off the beaten path studio to record this thing where they basically, it's their only job. They're just working the whole time. They start recording on February 13th. And, Steve Albini does everything that you would expect based on our discussions of Steve up to this point. He's using almost entirely analog equipment, not a lot of digital manipulation. He's really focused on trying to capture the natural acoustics of the room and basically the way that the instruments sound at the time. He really kind of described his role as being like a documentarian at this time, where he's like, I'm not telling you like, oh, why don't we make this a bossa nova record and totally flip this thing. He wants to hear what the band sounds like, and he's going to record it to the best of his ability and make it sound as good as possible. The band is super involved in like choosing the actual takes, which a lot of producers are not gonna workshop that with the band all the time in terms of which take is actually making it on the record. And one point that I think is interesting as like a former recording nerd, Kurt Cobain talked a lot in interviews about using a lot of microphones. It was a big thing that he always felt like was very necessary because to him, again, he wanted to sound like a band playing in a room. And his sense was that since microphones are so directional, just having like one mic on a speaker cabinet or maybe a secondary condenser, a couple feet back isn't going to give you the full sound of the room. So he wanted a ton of mics. And this was like a rub, I believe, with him and Butch Vig on the making of Nevermind previously. But Steve was glad to indulge, and that kind of suits his whole vibe in a lot of ways anyway. So some reports that I'd read said that they had nearly 30 microphones on the drum kit.
Wow. Okay.
Which is insane. That seems high to me.
It seems like a lot. Like physically, how do you fit that many at some point? Because Dave Grohl's not playing some Neil Peart sized kit. So
no, the phasing issues alone would be a nightmare. To actually have 30 microphones live and not have a huge phasing problem would be a nightmare. But
not to mention,
knows that better than me.
We've talked about this previously on probably several episodes at this point, but they're working on tape. He's not bouncing these out where every microphone has its own track in Pro Tools and it's easy to manipulate later if you need to and correct those phasing issues. It's just going to tape, and that's what it is. So if there's an issue, and it's just going to be there.
Well, yeah, and I don't know how many channels were on the tape head. It's not like he was necessarily bouncing it down to stereo tape. Like, right.
No. But there's still a hard limitation somewhere, even if it's a lot. Yeah. If you're recording 30 on the drums and you're trying to get the sound of a band in a room, that means there's more on everything else too. At some point, you run out of space, even on a super high-end desk.
Yeah, you do. And I do think having that many microphones is kind of an interesting thing with how the legend of this record is how like sort of raw it is. And in my head, like the rawest way you can capture a drum kit's like a 3 mic, like an overhead, a snare, and a kick. You know,
yeah, maybe like a Glenn Johns if you're getting fancy.
Yeah, exactly. When I think of like 30 microphones on a drum kit, I'm thinking this is making the next Tool album or something.
Right. Yes,
I find that a little bit odd, but regardless, it still definitely gave it a very raw and powerful sound, and you can hear that like energy and intensity throughout this record. Like the core instrumentation is all very aggressive. You're not hearing click tracks. Like it sounds raw. It sounds like a band, playing in a room.
For sure.
And allegedly they laid down like all of the instrumentation, or at least like most of it, in about 6 days.
Wow. That's
which
incredible.
is really fast.
Mm-hmm.
So the general sense that, in the way that I describe Steve working a lot, like they're showing up with these songs ready to go. They're not sitting around, in a recording studio in the Caribbean writing, a bridge per day and eventually completing one song every month like some people do.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, for sure. It seems clear if they recorded this whole thing in 6 days. I mean, as somebody who did a not well-known record in about that same amount of time, we had to come very prepared. There was a few things we did in studio, but we pretty much had everything figured out. There was just maybe 3 parts that we wrote in the studio. Everything else was already done. Yeah,
that's the thing. If you're in a band and you don't have infinite money, and you are trying to make a really good record, the trick is to do a lot of pre-production, get really ready to get practiced, know the songs really well, and be able to lay them down. Because you can record stuff pretty fast, especially if you're recording the whole band playing live. That can happen pretty fast as long as you're not having to stop for mistakes and whatnot.
Yeah. What we had to do is, it was mostly because of me, I had to put my vacation in at work a year in advance, and so we were like, we're going to go in the studio for a week. All right. Okay. When do we want to do it? We want to do it at this time. Okay. I'm putting my time in. We have to be ready by that time. And so it was a lot of practicing, a lot of writing. And then we went in and mostly did it. There was a couple overdubs and stuff that happened outside of that time frame, but for the most part, that's how we did it.
Yeah, 100%. That's the way you kind of knock it out. And it's worth noting, like, This album is praised for its sort of legendary visceral sound and stuff, but Steve Albini himself is very he rejects a lot of what you and I do here, of sort of this glorification of the recording process, and that there was this magic. In an interview that he gave on Conan O'Brien's podcast alongside Chris and Dave talking about this record, he basically says, I'm paraphrasing, he's like, every story you've ever heard about the magic that's happening inside the recording studio is all bull. He's like, none of that stuff ever happens. It's just what they do to make it sound all neat and interesting. He's like, when I went to record Dave's drum kit, I put up a couple of mics and it was a good sounding room, and I hit record. And interestingly, on that podcast, because this is very Steve always, his whole life was always like, I don't do nothing but throw up a couple of mics and hit the buttons, But Dave immediately pushes back, and he's like, no, well, you were using those German mics that have that really distinct sort of sweet sound. And do you remember you played with that positioning to get that mic in just the same spot? He's like, nah.
Yeah, he very much, it's funny because his attitude in those more major interviews does come across that way. Yet there are full videos of him showing you his mic technique that's very well thought out and clearly developed from a lot of different experimentation, and he thinks about it way more than he pretends to. I don't care what he says in that interview.
From listening to a lot of different things of him talking about stuff, it's obvious that he knows what he's doing, and it's obvious that he has very specific ways he wants to do it.
Yes,
I think what it mostly is he seems to have been fairly dogmatic. And so he's like, this is how I record an electric guitar, because he worked on it over time and kind of found the way that worked. And so that's why he's like, oh, there's nothing to it. You just do the thing. And it's like, well, but that was a you-ism that you developed over recording tons of bands over time.
That's like you being like, just make a string. You just wrap some wire around wire. It's no big deal.
Exactly. Yeah, there's nothing to it. You're like, well, there isn't, because it's set up and because we developed these settings over, working for years and years.
Yeah, and if you've done hundreds of thousands of them, maybe millions. I don't even know at this point. We lost track. So, yeah.
But that's a really good point, is that it's like it is automatic because you're an expert in it and have been doing it for a long time and have honed your craft and your skills and found the way you want to do it.
Maybe a better example of this, just that this is coming from dad experience, in real time right now. We don't even look at our shoes when we tie them. But if you think about it, it's actually a fairly complicated process, and you have to have a pretty decent level of dexterity to be able to tie your shoes. Yeah. But none of us even think about it anymore because we've done it thousands and thousands of times, and some of us do it slightly differently, and some of us like certain styles, and we do it every time. But no one thinks of tying your shoes as being complicated, but it actually is a little bit complicated.
When I was young, I could never tie my shoes the right way. I always ended up with one loop, and then I had to just like jam the like stiff end through the knot to like form a bow. and this just continued for like until I was like a teenager almost. And I was like sensitive about it a little bit. And then somebody showed me there's a way better way to tie your shoes where you just hold the two loops and then you just do one motion. That I probably couldn't have learned had I like had it down before him. But somebody showed me that, and I guarantee you, like I can tie a bow way better than you. You wouldn't believe.
Oh, mine are terrible. So I'm willing to learn.
I'll teach you next time I see you in person. It's a little hard to dictate, but it's literally like you just take them and then it's just one motion.
All right. Well, you have to make a video for me.
It's very cool. Yeah, that'll be our most popular video on the Stringjoy YouTube channel. Is showing people the trick to tying your shoes really fast.
All right, I like it. But it still is. You had to learn how to do that, right? And and you repeated it thousands of times, and now you don't even think about it.
Exactly. That's the way it works.
Mm-hmm.
Segueing slightly, we talked a lot about like the sort of gear nerdery that you would expect from us of how it was recorded and how it sounded. But there are also songs on this record that say things. Apparently there are lyrics in the songs.
What?
Me as an instrumentalist, I had no idea.
I didn't hear any of that.
But I think it's interesting to kind of look through this record because there's a lot of like somewhat confrontational elements in it. Like Serve the Servants, like it most notably like deals with that sort of disillusionment with fame that we talked about with the teenage angst has paid off well. Now I'm bored and old, is a sort of a famous way. I believe that like is the first line on the whole album. So it leads you right into it. There's a lot of body image stuff. Kurt Cobain in a interview, he described, he's like, oh, most of these songs are fairly medical in nature, which I thought was a weird way to put it.
Medical. Okay.
Yeah, they're not really medical, but there's a lot of body stuff. And that came out on the album cover, which we'll talk about later. But there's, there's pain. There's like Milk It, where it's mentioning suicide. In Pennyroyal Teas, talking about like, I'm so tired, I can't sleep. A lot of social commentary, that usual thing. Rape Me, of course, is like an anti-rape sort of song, or, I think you could read it that way. And of course, like a general heaping helping of like personal struggles, conflict, that sort of stuff, like All Apologies and Dumb. You have that self-doubt, a lot of that, sort of raw, authentic stuff that Kurt's really known for. But something that jumped out at me, I was listening to an interview in preparation for this with Kurt, and he's talking about how the lyrics aren't as personal as people make them, which I thought was interesting. People go back to all the Kurt lyrics as him just describing his life and his pain, and people really kind of understand this unknowable persona of Kurt Cobain via his lyrics. And so it was interesting hearing him just straight up being like, they're not about me, really. He's like, some of them kind of are, but a lot of this is just about stuff I was interested in.
Yeah, I mean, because we all know what happened to Kurt later on, but I think that I don't want to say it's romanticized because of the lyrics in this, but I think it's it's an easy line to draw, but maybe that's not the line that should be drawn. We don't really know. I mean, I've wrote songs before and people are like, oh, I see what you're saying here. And I'm like, actually, I don't think you do. And that's fine. Music's supposed to be up for interpretation. I'm not saying anybody's wrong for drawing that conclusion. I just think it's a rather straight line to draw. And Kurt was notorious for crooked lines.
Yeah. I think that we overlean on that when somebody dies early also. Maybe if Nick Cave had like died young, we would be like, that man was a deeply troubled mind who fantasized of murdering all sorts of people. He was just murder obsessed. But nobody thinks Nick Cave's murdering people, even though most of his songs are about murder at some level.
I love Nick Cave, man.
Me too. But like Kurt Cobain, Jeff Buckley, like people like this, we really dig into the lyrics because they're not around to comment on themselves. And of course, we know their life ended in tragedy. And so we think of every sort of negative moment from a song as being, oh, this is what was really going on inside their head. And that's not really that true. You know, it's been a while since I've written a song, but I used to spend a lot of time doing it. And a lot of times I would just write a song from a perspective of a character in a book I was reading.
Yeah, somebody that's completely not yourself at all. Or maybe it's yourself, but not in a way that you would ever actually behave or in a way that you would be in real life. It's a fantasy version of yourself. Or, like you said, characters, people from TV shows, some guy you saw and you just make up a story about him. All of these are valid ways to create.
Yeah, you see that guy and you're like, man, I wonder what that guy's been through. And then you dream it up and you write a song from that perspective. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I find it odd. And granted, I mean, a lot of Kurt's lyrics sound more personal than say like Nick Cave and the Bad Seeds records.
Sure.
But it was interesting to have him sort of plainly saying like, it's just what I was interested in. Mm-hmm. It's not exactly what it was about.
This record too, it has what I bounce around a little bit. My opinions change day to day like anybody else's, but it has what I've loudly proclaimed many times to be my favorite Nirvana song on it.
Which one?
Which is Francis Farmer Will Have a Revenge on Seattle.
Yeah.
That song's classic. So good. Oh, I love that song so much. And I actually found it later. Like we talked about earlier, all of these bands from anything before, I don't know, 2002, anything that was recorded before then, I feel like you and I found them all kind of at once. Yeah. So it's because it was before our time and we're big music nerds. So we dove into all of that stuff. So I found Nirvana through the radio. I didn't know that he was even dead. I had no idea. It was just, oh, this is a great song. Cool. And then you find out later. And I dove into In Utero probably around that time, probably about 2002, 2003. Mm-hmm. And I found that song and I was just like, what did Seattle do to this lady Frances? I just was, as a young kid, I was like, what happened here? I've always just been fascinated with that track. I was just telling my wife, Lynn, before we started recording, I really like Nirvana a lot. I've always liked them. I think they're one of the few bands that I've loved more as I've gotten older. I really love Nirvana. That every time I hear them, I'm like, man, this band's awesome. I just love them.
Yeah, I know what you mean. I think that when I heard Smells Like Teen Spirit first, obviously.
Of course. I'm sure I did too.
And all the other stuff. And I love All Apologies and Heart Shaped Box and all this stuff. But it maybe sounded a little simple to me back then. And I grew up playing guitar too. So this was kind of the beginning, from guitarist perspective, this is the beginning of the end of like the technical superstar, big guitar solo guy.
Well, Smells Like Teen Spirit was the first song I ever learned on guitar. So, yeah, it is definitely simple.
Yeah, but in retrospect, as I've gotten older, I've developed an appreciation for just how good of a songwriter Kurt is. Mm-hmm. He is a very good songwriter, and his melodic sense is incredible. There's a lot of very interesting chord substitutions and things that he's doing, maybe accidentally with theory. I'm not sure if he how cognizant he was of like what he was doing there, but really interesting things that are happening in the music, and he just had this natural knack for it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, he really had a great sense of melody. I like his lyrics a lot in a lot of the songs, and you know, I remember watching some VH1 thing of like, you know, top 10 best vocalists in music of all time, and he was like number 2. And I don't think I can say with a straight face that he is technically the greatest vocalist of all time. I think that would be disingenuous. But I love his voice, so that doesn't really matter. I love how it sounds.
Yeah, you hear it and you know it's him. And this is an era before the Scream Queen, where Kurt famously, like, he was screaming through his vocal cords. He would have a really hard time just singing like that for long stretches of time, from what I read. He could only do a certain number of takes, and then his voice would kind of wear out.
Yeah. He was not using what would be known today as proper technique. He's just belting just going.
And
for
I
it.
wonder if he would sound like that if he was.
I think from what I know of that, yes, that's the point, is to try to develop that sound in a way that doesn't crush your vocal cords, which a lot of people have managed to do. Randy Blythe being a great example from Lamb of God. Like, he's always sounded like that, even when he wasn't using good technique. Now he's just not blowing his voice out.
Mm-hmm. So changing gears a little bit, I always wonder when you're a band and you make an album and you're like, great, this is exactly what we wanted. And then you have to pick artwork for the album, how difficult that must be to start from scratch and decide what something should look like.
I've only done it a handful of times, but I can tell you, especially when there's a bunch of people in the band that all have to agree, it can get challenging.
Yeah, it can be very difficult. But they go with this very cool artwork. I think it's very iconic. It's actually like kind of the symbol I think of when I think of Nirvana. And it's this anatomical mannequin. You can see like intestines and all this sort of stuff with these angel wings that look really cool. And on the back is this collage of like organs and plastic fetuses and flowers and all this, odd stuff. So it does really relate to those quote unquote medical themes, but the birth, life, mortality, which obviously, of course, In Utero seems to kind of touch. They're making this very sort of authentic, raw, human sort of album. And as you would imagine, because it's 1993, this sparks some controversy.
Oh yeah, I am sure that the Tipper Gore was looking to slap that parental advisory all over this thing.
Exactly. Yeah. Walmart and Kmart, which Kmart mattered a lot more at this time, were upset about it. They changed the back. They took off I think some like the fetuses and stuff. And most notably, they changed the title of Rape Me on the Walmart and Kmart versions to Waif Me.
All right. No, I mean, don't get me wrong. I understand maybe why they would want to change it. That just is an odd substitution.
It's a bit odd. I'm sure it was up to the band what they wanted to go with there. They were just like, you can't say rape.
Yeah, fair enough.
And that's what they went to. The funniest thing I found is the version of this album that is still currently for sale in like the Arab states.
Oh, I don't know about this.
Yeah, it's very funny. So it's that cover. It's the same like anatomical mannequin with the wings and everything. But over her like body is what looks like a wetsuit. It's just like a black wetsuit covering like all of the body. But it very much like it's like shaped just like her. So it looks like she's just like wearing a wetsuit.
I mean, that does like tone it down a lot, but it also makes it more confusing.
Yeah, it's a bit odd. And I mean, it's not like, I guess they found it vulgar. It's like intestines and stuff, which I guess are vulgar in a different sense, but not like sexually vulgar.
No, it's just more like, I mean, I shouldn't say nobody. Very few people are going about their day hoping they see intestines. So I understand the shock value, but that's why they did it in the first place. So
yeah, exactly. And the label comes up with a few different alternate versions of like, what if it looked like this instead? And like, no. Nope, we wanted it to look like this.
It's kind of it's really interesting to think of. You're sitting there at the label, maybe you're David Geffen or maybe you're somebody else, and all right, my new golden child has laid an egg. Let's take a look at that album artwork.
And it's not just that there's some concerns with. This is an interesting thing to talk about because much has been said about the degree to which the label pushed back on not just the artwork but the album overall. There's a lot of talk of like that they said the album was unlistenable and not fit for a band of their stature, and there's rumors that the label didn't want to release the album at all. But I wasn't able to totally substantiate that. In fact, like I even found some things from Kurt while he was still alive, suggesting that they had critiques, but it never escalated to some level of like, we're not going to put this out or anything like that.
And I'm sorry if you listen. I mean, don't get me wrong. Tourette's is like full blown punk rock, very abrasive, like that's probably one of the most punk rock things Nirvana ever recorded. But Heart Shaped Box is so on brand for that band. It's not even funny. That could have easily been on the previous record.
I completely agree. Like Heart-Shaped Box is a great single. All Apologies. Like there's stuff in there for the label to like and be like, yeah, we're going to be able to put this onto the radio and it's going to work fine. They don't need every single track on the album to be radio friendly.
No, they don't. It's I wonder how much of that, because that sounds cool, right? The label didn't want to put this out, man. It's too dangerous. So that immediately makes every teenage kid go, well, I gotta hear it then. I gotta hear it. So yeah. I had always heard that story of like, oh, the label hated it and they didn't want to put it out. And it was only in doing this research that I found a lot of stuff that seemed to kind of run counter to that. Again, there's always input, but at the end of the day, I think Nirvana's the biggest band in the world. They're pretty darn glad to have them on their label. And so while they might, prefer it to be glossy and be another record that's going to sell, 30 million plus copies, at the end of the day, they're going to put the album out. They're not going to drop Nirvana and let any other label would be more than happy to pick it up and get a ton of guaranteed sales. Yeah, exactly. That's the thing. It's not so insane. I understand trying to view it through the lens of the times. It is shocking, but it's not even the most shocking thing that has come out. I mean, and I know this is a much more underground thing that most people weren't aware of until much later, but before this album came out, the whole like black metal scene was popping off. And with actual murders occurring and church burnings and all this like actually genuinely shocking and blatantly, openly evil stuff. And I'm not saying that as a critique. That's what they were going for. It's so much. I mean, even the band Venom is just like so much more jarring than Nirvana, really. I understand that it's maybe one of the more shocking things that the public at large have experienced, but it's not even the craziest thing that the music industry has churned out.
No, very much not. I mean, with the exception of like Rape Me, you don't have like these like there's some controversy, but there's more controversial stuff. I mean, Eminem was more controversial in a lot of ways. Lyrically. I think the main critique is just how raw the record sounds. But it's Nirvana, and this is what you're kind of used to. So I'd love to know more about the degree to which there's some truth. And at the end of the day, a label's a lot of people. So I'm sure that there were people that worked in departments there that are like, bah, this is garbage and it's not going to do anything. And then other people that are like, I think it's amazing. I love what they did. But like I had found in my research that allegedly the publicity team at Geffen particularly hated it and blamed Steve Albini for it, which is kind of funny. I'm sure he would love to take their ire.
Oh yeah, he's like, please blame me. I love taking the blame for this.
But at the end of the day, the band's a massive band and it's gonna sell a lot, and so to whatever degree they had pushback, they end up putting the album out.
Go ahead. Sorry.
Even if you thought it was going to be like not that well received, if you look up the history of a lot of albums that are considered to be like very blah albums that people made, a lot of them went to like number 1 or number 2 because people just wanted that record because it was the biggest band at the time. Even if later on it was considered this huge letdown critically, it sells some records.
That's the thing is there, unless the label thought for some reason that this was going to cost them money, they're going to put it out.
Yeah.
And they know it's not going to. They already spent the money for it. They know they're going to get it back in the first 3 days that they drop this record. So who cares whether it's viewed as a classic or not? We're going to get our money. I think that was probably, I've always hypothesized that was way overblown and possibly a marketing tactic.
Yep. That's a really good point about the marketing, the marketability of that. If you were trying to market a band that their whole thing was rejecting the corporate mainstream, you would kind of want to make it seem like, oh, the label hated this. The band just barely got them to put it out. That would be exactly what you would want to tell that narrative.
Of course. Yeah, it fits the narrative perfectly.
And so the album comes out. And as we kind of noted, it debuts at number 1 in the Billboard 200, sells 180,000 copies in its first week. It sells 1 million records pretty quickly by late 1993. As of current, it's sold a little over 6 million records, so it's 6 times platinum. So by all regards, there's some sales coming from this this record. Not as much as Nevermind. Certainly.
No.
But ain't no label minds having a 6 million album selling album, especially one that they got to record for 2 weeks at a studio. Like not a ton of cost involved in this whole thing. Critically, there were some mixed reviews, but generally positive. I think kind of the biggest theme that came out from reviews at the time is like, hey, they didn't go mainstream, and that's kind of the main thing that I want to wrap this up in talking about. Is what I think is so cool about this record is a band that is this big, this commercially successful. There's this much money on the line, and yet they decide to go completely back to their roots and make this record. Kurt, in one interview, talks about how a bunch of his friends don't even like the record. He's basically saying, he's like, the band loves it. We're like the music that we always wanted to make. It's the sound that's in our head. But yeah, a bunch of my friends think it sucks too, but it's the music we want to make. And that there's so much integrity in that,
There's something about Nirvana that I'm just formulating now in real time. So forgive me if it's a little disjointed, but in the beginning, they had nothing to lose, so they did whatever they wanted, right? They got enough attention and success that they were able to make Nevermind, and it was just an absolute game changer in every way. And then they had something to lose after that, but it was so successful that no matter what they did, their lifestyle wasn't going to change. If this album completely flopped, their life would have been exactly the same.
Yep.
They would still be selling out arenas. They would still be doing these huge tours. Or if they wanted to sit back and do nothing at all, that was an option too. So both in the beginning and in the end, they kind of had nothing to lose in a weird way, even though they were the biggest band in the world. It was just like, too big to fail at that point. Even if this album flops and sells 20,000 copies, it doesn't matter because our other one was so successful that it can basically wash away any sins from the next 20 years of our lives.
Yep. And I think for them, I get the sense that, especially for Kurt, maybe for the other guys too, I get the sense that what they cared the most about was being seen as authentic and being seen as having integrity to the sound that they wanted. And I think I can imagine if I put myself in their shoes that they were afraid of having sold out. And what they really wanted was to just be like, hey, we made the music that we wanted to make. And this album really made that clear, and it wasn't intended at the time to be the final album that Nirvana put out, though it was. And I do wonder, it might have even sold more if they'd been able to more thoroughly tour behind it and all that stuff. But of course, Kurt's death put an abrupt end to that.
Yeah. And it makes you wonder, and I'm not the first person to have this thought, what would the next album have even been like? Because this progression that you see makes total sense to me. But what would they have done next? And would it have been more aggressive? Would they have leaned more into feedback and screaming? Would it have leaned more into the acoustic side with the success of the Unplugged, MTV show? I don't know. It's something that I've kind of fantasized about. Like, I wonder what would have happened. But
yeah, would it have come back the other way? Would they have started to integrate synthesizers and things?
Yeah. We've seen what happens when people get access to a lot of gear. The sounds tend to get wackier.
We certainly have. And I'm so sensitive to what it must be like being a mainstream artist and having to try to achieve the heights that you set up on your prior work, while at the same time feeling like you have to keep pushing forward and doing something new and different. That pressure sounds really difficult to deal with to me. That would hurt, I think.
Yeah, because what I think a lot of people as consumers forget, the pressure isn't just from the labels or the fans or whatever. There's an internal pressure as well, because now it's not just about you. When you're writing music in your bedroom for yourself, it's all about you. But once there's a big machine is true, but probably not the best way to put it. Once there's a bunch of mouths to feed off of this thing, all of a sudden there's pressure. And you're pressured to have sales, and you're pressured to perform, and you're pressured to have a certain amount of tickets, at each venue. And there's just an enormous amount of pressure and responsibility you start to feel. And everyone looks at these people, oh, it must be great to be a rock star. And I'm sure that in a lot of ways it is. But I think a lot of these people realize it is a business. And if I don't do my job properly, my tech doesn't eat.
Yep.
Like, that's just how it works.
That's just, I'm so glad you said that, because it sparked something too in my head that I hadn't thought about going into this. But a common thing that happens with music, or probably any sort of art form, is that while you're writing those songs for your first big record, you're not super rich. And so you have like a lot of relatable experiences that you can talk about. That's what your life is. And you're writing from the perspective of just a person. And so you make this album and people relate to it and all this. But then when it comes time to make the next record, not only do you have the pressure like we talked about, but you also, your life is different. So like the things that you would complain about is, they serve me the wrong kind of caviar. Not literally that though. It's much more like the press won't leave me alone and all those like problems that come with the trappings of fame. And I think that's a really difficult thing for a lot of artists, because that stuff isn't relatable. No one cares. Like, you really have to continue to write from the perspective of who you were beforehand. For most people, Eminem maybe didn't. I mentioned him earlier, but he had kind of fun with being famous, I think, lyrically. But most people can't pull that off, and just nobody wants to hear about it. They just don't. They want you to continue to be relatable. And I hadn't thought about it, but I've never really given Kurt like credit for that in this album. It does not, for the most part, come off as an album written by a now rich and famous person complaining about rich and famous problems. It has the same angst and humanity that he has on his earlier work, I think.
Yeah. Nobody wants to hear the comedian be like, well, let me tell you about airplanes and how much trouble it is when the like, that become a trope and a cliche for a reason. Like, nobody can relate to the fact that your first class wasn't up to par, buddy. Like, we're tired of hearing about it. It doesn't matter.
Yeah, I think I've never given him credit for that. I think that's a unique thing about this album too. It feels like it's being written by the same person that wrote Nevermind or Bleached or anything.
And it seems like that was very intentional. Like, now that I'm on top of the world, how can I still communicate with the bottom?
Yeah. And you almost get the sense, though, I mean, I don't know the guy or anything, but you almost get the sense that the fame didn't change him that much, at least musically. Other people could speak to that more in terms of like him and his life and all that. Certainly, I'm sure it did. But it doesn't change the music. It doesn't change the guy that he's writing from. Yeah.
And I think that authenticity is why so many of us love Nirvana so much. And he managed to maintain that through a time that it'd be pretty difficult to do so.
Yep, I agree. And I think that's why this album, this is my favorite Nirvana album. The band considered it their masterpiece. I think it is too. And it's just, more than anything, it's one of the bravest acts of music that I can think of in musical history. And such a singular focus on making the album they wanted to make, regardless of everything else. And granted, maybe that's easier when you are the biggest band in the world, because like we said, the label's going to want to put it out regardless. If you had like kind of a middling, first or second album, and then it was the last one on your deal, you might have to listen to them a little bit more. But still, I think to be that famous and that successful and then make that unique of an artistic statement is really unique. Doesn't happen all the time. And that's why I think this album is such a cool story in musical history.
Love it. That seems like a good spot to wrap these things up. What do you think?
Take it away, buddy.
Hey, everybody. Thank you for getting to this point. I really appreciate you. Please like, comment, subscribe wherever you're watching or listening to this. It really, really moves the needle a lot. We're trying to claw our way up the music charts. We keep hitting some pretty interesting places on those charts. And again, I'm not exactly sure how they work, but I know the more you interact with the show, the better. And share this with your friends, tell your family, force people to listen to it. Tie them to a chair and make them listen to this entire episode. Yeah. Wait, is that legal? Maybe don't.
I do not endorse this statement.
I'm just kidding, folks. Don't do that. But you should like grab their phone and download it on their podcast player, so they just accidentally happened upon it later. That's the way to do it. Yeah. All right, everybody. Thank you very much. We will talk to you next week. and I don't know what we're going to talk about, but I'm sure it's going to be good. Oh, it's going to be my turn. I'm going to have to figure it out. Oh, no.
Yep. Good luck.
Ah!